Okay, this is take 3 of trying to tape this audio lecture. All right, so we're going to continue our discussion on verbal behavior to talk about the other verbal operants. So by the end of this lesson and alongside your readings, you will hopefully be able to identify, describe, and give examples of the different verbal operants. Identify under which antecedent and consequence control each verbal operant occurs. So as we talked about last day, with Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, it's important to remember that verbal behavior is determined by its function and not its form. However, there are different forms of the same verbal operant, meaning there are different ways that one can emit a mand. So in the example in front of you, one could emit the mand by using a sign language, the form of sign language. They could sign juice. They could use a verbal response. They could say juice. They can exchange a picture of juice, can write juice, can type juice. All of these different forms still seek the same function, manding. Okay? And of course, we want to teach the different functions of language. We want to teach an individual, say about apples. We want to be able to teach them to mand for apple, but we also want them to be able to identify one when they see one and be able to name a food and be able to come up with the word apple. But in addition to that, we must assess which form is easiest for the learner to acquire and to use to achieve a function, which can be especially important when we're talking about something like problem behavior, where this person has a learning history of engaging in some form of maladaptive behavior, such as aggression or hitting. When it comes to trying to train up a new response, we want to select something that has the lowest response effort. We want it to be an easy response for the learner to emit, so that it easily becomes the choice when that person has the motivation to attain a particular reinforcer, like attention. They will choose to emit the easier response. When two are paired together, they'll choose to emit, say, a PEX response. So choosing the form of the response is crucial to ensuring that it will be learned and generalized and all those good things. So, for example, in teaching manding, do we want to teach the form of sign language or PEX or verbal language? And one thing we want to be cautious of as behavior analysts is we want to ensure that we select the form that is best for the individual learner. We want to select the form. We want to be cautious of belonging to, say, particular camps, like I'm a sign language person, or I'm a PEX person, or I only focus on verbal language. We want to remember that our choice should be based on what makes sense for that individual learner. Okay? And we want to not let our biases or our learning history determine what makes sense for that learner. Okay? So, for example, certainly wouldn't want to be choosing sign language with someone with extremely poor motor control, or verbal language with a child who, say, isn't emitting any kind of echoic, imitative responses. So all of those things need to be considered. Okay, so the first category of Skinner's verbal operants are duplex, which echoics and mimetics can fall under this category. And echoic, quite simply, is when you say chair when someone else says chair. And a mimetic, much the same, is also an imitative type response, except that it's a sign response. Signs chair when someone else signs chair. And it's like basic verbal imitation, and another person's verbal behavior controls what response is made. It must match identically. And the reinforcer is social. So, again, this is simple imitation. Whatever's said by the one person is imitated by the other, and there's a non-specific generalized social reinforcement, which is, of course, contrary to something like manding, where the reinforcement is quite specific. If one mands for juice, they get juice. If one mands for a hug, they get a hug. It's very specific reinforcement, whereas what you'll see is in all the other categories of verbal operants. It's more of a generalized social reinforcement. Okay, so for example, a teacher says chair, student says chair, teacher says good, you said chair. Okay, typically an echoic response in early language training is used to shape articulation, to teach other more difficult verbal behavior. And without an echoic repertoire, language training, of course, can become very difficult because a lot of our language training really relies on the learner being able to echo a particular response. Children without an echoic repertoire may need to emphasize, this is what we may need to do if you note that we don't see a strong echoic repertoire. So we may need to work on motor imitation. There's been demonstrated to be a link between fine motor imitation and language. But also, at the same time, we may want to be using some augmentative systems such as PECS or SIGN to get that, at least get the manding and the other types of operants going. Tax is named for the word contact, meaning contact with the environment. It's naming something or describing the property of something that is present in the environment. Okay, so that the speaker can contact some nonverbal stimulus. Okay, it's can be nouns, pronouns, adjectives, prepositions, actions, etc. And can also, it's important to note that a person can also tact their own private events. So I could tact that I have a headache. I have a headache is a tact. I'm tacting my own internal private event. Okay, now tacts are typically acquired through an operant discrimination training process, meaning, training up what is it, holding up two things or whatnot, and show me the car, or what is it, and the person identifies the car. Sorry, show me the car is typically a bit of a receptive / tact response. The antecedent is a nonverbal stimulus, like just the item being present in the environment. The response is to actually label the stimulus or describe some property of it, which is big, small. And the consequence, again, is social reinforcement. Okay, so some nonverbal stimulus, some item in the environment, a specific verbal response. Airplane, if you think about your toddler, and non-specific reinforcement. Good, Charlie, that is an airplane. Very good. So another example, child is standing near a chair, instructor touches the chair and says, "What's this?" Child says chair, instructor says, "That is a chair." Good. Okay, students on a trampoline, the instructor says, "What are you doing?" Student says jumping, the instructor says, "Nice talking, you are jumping." Tacting in action there. Now, just because I know the question always does come up later, and if you're not concerned with this now, don't worry about it. For a tact to be a tact in terms of Skinner's analysis, all you need is some item in the environment. But when we're teaching tacts, we always use prompts, such as "What's this?" or "What are you doing?" Technically, that's a verbal prompt, which can make this response look a bit like an intraverbal, which we'll talk about in a second. But in fact, it's just a verbal prompt that we use. Okay, because the difference will be in a second. When we see intraverbals, there's not necessarily the presence of some visual stimulus in the environment. Okay, so what's important to note with tacts is that teaching tacts alone does not mean that they will transfer to mands, which I think is probably the most groundbreaking sort of finding that we've had with people that have worked in the field of the analysis of verbal behavior. And because what they found is that just because you can say the word cookie when you see one does not mean they can ask for cookie when I want one. And unfortunately, some of the early autism programs, and I certainly was one of them, we were teaching children to label a host of different types of stimuli, yet these kids also weren't able to then ask for those stimuli. It was a separate response. Okay, and this is largely because, if you look at the analysis of verbal behaviors, because there are different reinforcers responsible for maintaining those verbal operants. Mands involve very specific reinforcement. They get the item they requested. Whereas tacts involve non-specific reinforcements of the form social. You're right, that is an airplane. Good job, Charlie. Things like that. Okay, so consider for a second what do you want versus what is it. With a mand, what do you want juice box is on the table. That could set up to look like to look like attacked. Child says juice, and they get the juice. Attacked, on the other hand, juice box is on the table. You say, what is this? They say juice. Good, you're right, it is juice. There's social reinforcement. They get some form of high five, but they don't get the juice. And if you're training up some form of man to be attacked, like something that the child liked, like juice, if you're going to train that up, you would have to train up, what is this? They say good juice. You say, good, it is juice. What do you want? And then you would immediately tag the man on the back so they had the opportunity to attain reinforcement in the form of juice, if that was something they were also reinforced by. Okay, receptive language. This is probably one of the more well-known verbal operants because it does fit in line with any kind of speech therapy model or traditional language instruction. Receptive language is simply the physically responding to someone's verbal behavior, such as instructions, directions, or requests. The antecedent or stimulus is verbal behavior of someone else, and the child's response is physically engaging in and completing the requested action, like, go get your coat. They walk off and get their coat. The consequence is social reinforcement. Good, you did get your coat. Okay, so there's some form of specific verbal behavior, like touch your head. The specific nonverbal response is the child touches their head, and they get some form of non-specific reinforcement. That's right, good touching your head. Okay, when the instructor says touch the chair, child touches the chair. Nice job touching the chair. Okay, Pierre says throw the ball to me. Child throws the ball. The instructor says, wow, the peer should say Pierre. Good, you threw the ball to me. Okay, so it's important to note that the notion of receptive can be divided into receptive identification and receptive instruction. Receptive identification is quite simply where someone identifies something when asked. Show me the car, and that item is present in the environment and the child points to the car. And we typically train this up in an operant discrimination training procedure, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, like putting 3 flashcards on the table, show me the car, they show you the car from 2 other different stimuli. Okay, so this is where they're identifying a specific item. It's a receptive identification. Touch A. Letters A, B, and C are present in an array. The child touches A. Wonderful, you touched A. Turn over the fish. Child turns over the fish photo. Wow, you did it. You turned over the fish. Great job. Okay, versus like a receptive instruction task, which I noticed that here that I don't have a separate slide. But a receptive instruction task would be something like where you're instructing the child to do something. Touch your head. Go get your coat. Go get your shoes. All of those types of things. Put your seatbelt on. Okay, the next category, that's a form of receptive here, and it's just evolved out of Sundberg and Partington's Abel's work, is feature, function, and class. This is just sort of prepping the learner for more relevant language conversational skills. Okay, so a feature is some visible or common element associated with a particular object. So for example, a dog has legs. So you might say, tell me something with legs. And the person would say, a dog. Function is what the object typically is used for or does. Show me something you eat. The child points to an apple. And a class is the category or grouping that the object is a member of. Show me food, child shows you the apple. Okay, so note that, these categories sort of overlap with one another. Some people might say the function of an apple is food, but also a class of the function of an apple is something you eat, but also a class of apple could also be something you eat. So there's some overlap here, and for the purposes of teaching, you'll just decide what you're going to put in each category. Okay, so here's some examples. So feature, it has 4 legs. It's the feature of the stimulus. Function, it's something you sit on. And class is furniture. Okay, so probably most of you maybe if you're well trained, are thinking of the response chair. And so when we're training a learner up to know feature function in class, we spend some time teaching them to show you something that has 4 legs, show you something that you sit on, show you the one that's furniture. You'd probably teach each one of these up differently. Then you might have several examples of each, and then you teach them in discrimination arrangement. Okay, another example, show me something that's sweet and sour, and on the table you might have a picture of, lemonade, a tree, and a car. You'd say, show me something that you drink, and show me a summer beverage. And you would train up the child to respond to lemonade under all of those different discriminative stimuli. Okay, so receptive feature function in class, it involves some sort of nonverbal response. Touch something you eat. Child touches the apple. Wonderful, an apple is something you eat. Great. And the only thing that differs a receptive by feature function in class from a tact by feature function in class is that in the tact category, the learner is expected to make a verbal response, an expressive response. Okay, tell me something that you eat. An apple is not present. Child says apple. Yes, an apple is something you eat. And again, that differs from a receptive function by feature in class. You would say, show me something you eat, and the child would point to an apple. The instructor would say, yes, that is an apple. Good. And then when you take it to the next level, you get into intraverbals by feature function in class. And the only thing that differs from the other two here is that there's no stimuli present. Because intraverbal is that foundational conversation starter skill where no salient environmental stimulus needs to be present. Okay, so an instructor would say something like, tell me something you write with. No item is present. Child says pencil. Yes, a pencil is something you write with. Okay, so you can see there's a nice little sequence here. You might go from receptive to tact to intraverbal by simply fading out your stimuli. Okay, so that brings us to intraverbals, which is a verbal operant emitted about something that is not present in the immediate environment. And one good example of this is those word association games. If you've ever played those or you ever took any courses in psychology undergrad where they talked about these, whereas one person or your therapist says candy, you say the first thing that comes to mind, sweet. They say bed, you say sleep. They say bed, you say pillow. And this is sort of necessary conversational exchanges. Okay, so what you're noticing here is in the word association example, candy and sweet, those are 2 different words, they do not match. And that's what's crucial about the intraverbal response. Okay? Another example of this is answering WH questions like, where's the local 7-Eleven? Or fill in the blanks. Type examples. Okay, so the verbal response here does not match. So you have some sort of specific verbal behavior, like ready, set, and then you have a specific but non-matching verbal response. So maybe a child would say go, and you have non-specific reinforcement. Great, ready, set, go, or something along those lines. Here's some examples. When you say Jack and Jill went up the child says hill. You say what comes after 3. Child says 4. Again, remember no stimuli in the environment, and the response does not match. The listener's response does not match the speaker's response. Is your mom's name Anne? You might say yes or no. Hi, Becky. They say hello. Did you eat lunch yet? No. What will you have? Coconut soup. Sounds delicious? It was very good. See how this back and forth exchange of language is unmatched, okay, but also foundational conversation. Okay, so interverbals, usually introductory interverbal skills that we teach with young learners are things like nursery rhymes, counting by rote, and saying the alphabet. Allows us to learn sort of more advanced knowledge in the absence of tangible items like math, science, etc. And like I said before, allows us to have conversations.